Look, I agree, it's a very nice item, but I can't stress this enough. It's not the deluxe anniversary edition of Frost and Fire that I ordered. No, it won't play on my turntable. It's not even a record. It's like a book or something. I don't even think it says Frost and Fire anywhere on the cover. Okay, well, how long will it take to send me a replacement? You serious? No, I don't mind paying a little extra for shipping. That's okay. Okay, yes, I will hold on to this. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, look, I gotta take care of something. Thank you so much for understanding. Sorry if I intruded on your personal time. Yes, thank you so much. Okay. Yeah, you have a nice day too. Goodbye. It's the last time I tried buying vinyl on eBay. Anyway, welcome back, fellow travelers. On this episode of Appendix N Adventures, we'll be looking at Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. Let's get to it. Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser is a series of sword and sorcery stories written by Fritz Leiber, published originally in various pulp fiction magazines starting in 1939. The stories were eventually compiled chronologically into 7 different books, starting with 1970's Swords and Deviltry, and ending with 1988's The Knight and Knave of Swords. The series stars the rascally, self-styled gentleman thieves Fafhrd the Barbarian and his best friend and accomplice, the Grey Mouser, or as I like to call them, Pfaff and Mouse. The characters were loosely based on the friendship between Leiber himself and his writing partner, Harry Otto Fischer, who is often credited with co-creating the characters as well as the lore of the world they live in. The stories follow Pfaff and Mouse as they explore the vast world of Naywan, delving into deep, dark dungeons, hunting for treasure, fighting evil monsters, and serving as mercenaries to wizards and warlords alike. If you haven't caught on by now, the impact that this series had on the fantasy genre, including fantasy role-playing, was huge. For the sake of full transparency, I should point out to you guys that I've only read the first 2 books in this 7-book series, Swords and Deviltry and Swords Against Death. That might not seem like a lot, but these actually contain the first 14-ish stories of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. So with just these 2 books, you're getting a very decent sampler of what the series has to offer. And I can already tell the huge impact that they've had on the fantasy genre. I should also point out that I definitely need to get some new reader copies. I have these 2 old 1970s paperback editions that are flaking and crumbling all over the place. I love having them as part of the collection, but every time I open them, I feel like they're going to disintegrate, especially this copy of Swords and Deviltry. Yep, there go the pages. I'll pick those up in a second. But yeah, I need to get some new reader copies, and when I do, I'll probably pick up the rest of the series. At some point when I've read more of the series, I might make an addendum to this video, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, let's just talk about what I like about the series. And considering that Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser have been part of my little slideshow intro that I've been doing for my channel ever since I started it, it might come as no surprise to know that I actually like this series quite a bit. I think the best part of this series, or at the very least the part that I enjoyed the most, is Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser themselves. I know, the title characters are the best part of their series, but I do think that the relationship between these 2 characters and the roles that Fritz Leiber has them play out in their stories is kind of the linchpin that holds this whole series together. I don't know if he did it on purpose or whether it just came about as a result of the function that he needed these characters to perform, but they're essentially the best of... These 2 characters are the best of Conan the Barbarian distilled into 2 separate characters. Again, I don't know if he meant to do it this way, but if you've read Conan, as written by Robert E. Howard, you know that the character is not only this very strong warrior, he's also this very crafty thief. And Conan, if you break him down into those two separate characteristics, they basically make up Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. Fafhrd is this barbarian. He's from this tribe of northern northern barbarians who live out in this icy country, and he's incredibly strong, incredibly powerful. He's the first to jump into a fight. If you give him any kind of weapon, he's going to be proficient in that kind of weapon. And he's the guy you want on your side in the fight. He might not be the smartest guy in the group, but he is the guy that you want on your side in a big fight. And on the other hand, you have the Grey Mouser, who is this very crafty, very intelligent thief, who he's very stealthy, very cunning. He'll get in and out of a house with all their treasure before the people there even know he was there. And he also has some knowledge, some limited knowledge of magic, because he was originally a sorcerer's apprentice before he became a thief. And so you have these two characters representing the best parts of Conan the Barbarian. And the thing I found about sword and sorcery is that it's really a lone wolf kind of genre. When you have a sword and sorcery story, the main character is really the only focus. He might have some other characters who join him on his adventures, but he is the main focus. But with this series, we have two main characters who both share the spotlight, and they do a really good job. On their own, they might be pretty weak, but together they are the perfect adventuring team. They balance out each other's weaknesses. And what's really interesting is that despite the fact that they're thieves, despite the fact that they're criminals, they have this very wholesome, manly relationship. It's really interesting how Leiber wrote those characters. Like I said, they were originally based on his friendship between Fritz Leiber and Harry Otto Fischer. These guys created the characters while they were in college. They would write letters to each other, role-playing as these two fantasy characters. And you can see very clearly the friendship between these two men in the characters of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. And you don't really see that kind of thing in modern fantasy unless it has some kind of plot twist going on. But and you definitely don't see it in Sword and Sorcery. But having these two characters be in this very wholesome, very brotherly relationship was something really interesting. They're kind of inseparable. If Fafhrd in trouble, the Grey Mouser will drop everything to go help him. If the Mouser is in trouble, Fafhrd will drop everything he's doing and try to save the Mouser. No matter what they do, they're always in it together. They're always supporting each other. And so it's this really kind of touching brotherly love that goes on between these two gentlemen rogues in a world of sword and sorcery. I thought that was very interesting. The world of Naywan in itself is a very interesting setting. There's not nearly as much in-depth or complex world building as you'd find in a more modern fantasy story, but there's just enough that gives the reader a real sense of what's going on and kind of gets their imagination going. Fritz Leiber does a good enough job of sprinkling those proper nouns all over the place, so you know that there are things going on in the world other than what our heroes are doing right at this moment. It's a very believable, lived-in kind of world, and the things that we see, where we see them, are interesting enough. But the things that we don't see, Leiber gives us just enough to latch on and use our imagination to fill in the blanks. But where he doesn't do that, in the one place he doesn't do that, is the city of Lankmar. Lankmar is awesome. It is this huge city of thieves, this wretched hive of scum and villainy, as a wise Jedi Knight would put it. And a lot of Fafhrd and the Mouser's adventures happen in and around Lankmar. The way Leiber describes it, you feel like it's just a city that's purely made up of taverns and gambling houses and shifty storefronts and thieves' dens. There's an actual thieves' guild that makes their headquarters there. There are places with names like the Silver Eel Tavern, or Cheap Street, or Beggar's Street. There's a place called the Fountain of Dark Abundance, I believe. That one leapt out to me particularly. You just get a sense that it's this really dark, dingy, grimy, scummy kind of place. And it's an excellent setting for two swashbuckling heroes to have these sword and sorcery adventures. It provides for a really interesting tone to these stories. And the tone is pretty consistent all the way through. I will say that it does a very good job of blending action and adventure with a little bit of horror and actually a little bit of humor. It's not like the series is a parody or anything, but I do think that Fritz Leiber knew that he was writing to an audience of fantasy fans. At the time he was writing these stories, magazines like Weird Tales had already set a precedent for what fantasy stories were like. And so I think when he wrote these stories, he had the idea that he was going to write these stories to to sort of celebrate the fantasy genre and maybe poke fun at it a little bit, because there's a lot of really dark gallows humor going on in these stories. Some of it is really subtle, but it's really kind of tongue-in-cheek, and there are quite a few times where I laughed out loud at what was going on in the story. Some of it's pretty tongue-in-cheek, some of it's actually pretty out there and kind of absurd, but it makes for a very charming tone. That's the one word that I can use to describe this whole series. It's very charming. But just because something is charming, that doesn't make it perfect. Now I got to talk about some of the things I really didn't like about the series, which thankfully there aren't that many. But unfortunately, the first thing that really tripped me up was Fritz Leiber's writing style. Now I'm not saying that Fritz Leiber was a bad writer. In fact, I think he was a very good writer. But I think he also thought of himself as something of a poet, because there's multiple times in multiple short stories where his vocabulary becomes very verbose and very over-descriptive, and the prose becomes very purple, if you know what I mean. The thing about sword and sorcery, or rather the thing about writing sword and sorcery, is that you want it to be very fast-paced. You want it to be very quick and punchy and get to the action really quickly. And there's not a lot of time to dwell on really vivid descriptions or vivid metaphors or anything like that. But that's precisely what Fritz Leiber does on multiple occasions. If I've learned anything from the few professional editors that I've worked with, it's that usually when you feel like you have to be overly descriptive in a scene, you usually don't, especially when you're writing an action-heavy story like this. There are so many times when Leiber uses like 4 or 5 different words to describe a scene where 1 or 2 would have been perfectly fine. But even though it did get on my nerves, I don't think that's the worst part of the series. The worst part, I think, is that there were quite a few stories in the 14 that I read that have really great setups. All the stories have great setups, but there are a few that have these really cool premises where Leiber is introducing these cool fantasy elements, and he has a lot of world building going on. He has a lot of really good character banter, and you're getting really sucked into the story. And then you turn the page and you notice that there's only a couple paragraphs left in the story. The plot has just gotten started, it feels like, but there's only a couple more paragraphs, and then the story just comes kind of crashing down in on itself. Everything comes to a head, and it resolves in a really kind of flat, disappointing way. And that happened multiple times. The times I saw it the most were with the story The Sunken Land, which has a great setup. Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser are talking about this ancient civilization that was lost to time and whether or not it still exists. And throughout the course of the story, they get the chance to discover if this place really exists. But by the time they do, everything's already over. At that point, it felt like Leiber was just ready to end the story right there. And we were told that there might be some kind of eldritch something or other going on, but that's it. And then the story ends and the characters move on and act like nothing ever happened. And it was really annoying. The only other time where that really got to me was in Fafhrd's origin story, The Snow Women, which is the first or the second story in Swords and Deviltry. And in that story, we get to see what Fafhrd's life was like among his people in the frozen north, what his tribe was like. We see how he really resents his tribe. He doesn't like being around his people, and he wants to see the world. And he makes friends with this, I believe they're a traveling theater troupe that visits his tribe. And he makes friends with them. He falls in love with one of the actresses, and he plans on escaping with her and seeing the world. And right as things get going, it just kind of ends abruptly. Thankfully, though, most of the other stories did seem very well plotted out. They do have satisfying endings. But those few just kind of bugged me, because it felt like they had so much potential and just squandered it. All right, but enough of this armchair literary criticism. Let's get to my favorite part of the video. Let's talk about the impact that this series has had on Dungeons & Dragons and fantasy role-playing games, because it turns out it's quite a lot. If you would have told me that Gary Gygax came up with Dungeons & Dragons as a way to reenact his favorite scenes and adventures from the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser series, I would believe you, because the adventures that our heroes go on in this series, it really is the stuff that D&D campaigns are made of. Like I said in the beginning of the video, there's plenty of dungeon crawling and treasure hunting and monster killing and signing pacts with mysterious eldritch wizards. In fact, I'll read you this scene. I wrote this down. I'll read it to you, and you'll see if this sounds familiar. You and your friends enter a crowded tavern. The lighting is dim. There are shifty figures everywhere, and the whole place smells of mold. But the drinks are cheap, and the proprietor knows you well enough to keep the riffraff out of your business. As you sit down to enjoy your ale, and the warbling singing of a foppishly dressed bard belting out the ballad of some ancient hero you've never heard of, you are approached by a strange old man in a black cloak and hood. "Greetings," he says. I hear that you are among the most daring adventurers in all the kingdom. Perhaps you would be interested in undertaking a certain quest. I know, right? Sounds like the beginning of literally every generic Dungeons & Dragons adventure ever. But what I just described to you is almost verbatim the beginning of the story The Bleak Shore from Swords Against Death. That's the kind of stuff we're working with here. That's the kind of stuff that Gary Gygax was clearly inspired by when he was originally writing the rules and the settings for Dungeons & Dragons. It should also be pointed out that the Grey Mouser might actually be the inspiration for the Thief class in D&D. Now, obviously, thieves have been around since Dungeons & Dragons was a thing. They're called rogues in more recent editions. And by the way, if you ever want to start an argument with an old school D&D fan, bring up the whole thief versus rogue debate, and you will get lectured at for hours on end. It's pretty crazy. But yeah, D&D thieves owe a lot to the Grey Mouser. He was stealthy, he could infiltrate buildings, he was a lockpick, he was a pickpocket, he could disarm traps, and those skills are obviously the calling cards for the traditional thief class in Dungeons & Dragons. And I don't think this is the case, but I wouldn't be surprised if the 5th edition subclass, the Arcane Trickster, was partially inspired by the Grey Mouser and his dabbling in magic. I think also the Thieves Guild from Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser had a big impact on D&D because in multiple editions of D&D, when a thief reaches a certain level, he can essentially start his own Thieves Guild. He can establish a home base out of which he can hire fences and apprentice thieves to do his dirty work for him while he's out in the world adventuring with his friends and having a good time. I know it's only tangentially related to D&D, but I think that the Thieves Guild was also a big inspiration on the Thieves Guild from the Elder Scrolls series. So, if you've ever wondered why Brynjolf and his friends are a bunch of lazy bums who sit around doing nothing at the Ragged Flagon all day while you run around all of Skyrim breaking into people's houses and threaten extortion money out of them with a superior grade Elven Dagger soul snares, you can blame Fritz Leiber. But as cool as all of that is, nothing can compare to the fact that TSR wasn't just inspired by Fritz Leiber. They included him in their legacy. And what I mean by that is that apparently Fritz Leiber and his old friend Harry Fisher were also aspiring game developers. In 1976, they developed their own board game simply titled Lankhmar, and it was published by TSR Hobbies. Then in 1980, TSR put out the Deities and Demigods supplement for Dungeons & Dragons, and this included, among other things, various characters and settings from famous fantasy works, including Nawan, Lankhmar, and Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, as well as Elric from Michael Moorcock's Elric of Melniboné series. And yes, I will continue to bring up Michael Moorcock in every one of these videos until more of you people start reading his books. Then in 1985, TSR put out the Lankhmar City of Adventure module, which not only could be integrated into the then current edition of D&D, but could also be played as its own self-contained role-playing game. And of course, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser had their own character stat blocks in that game, so that Dungeon Masters could put those characters into their campaigns, and really cool Dungeon Masters could let their players play as those characters, which is pretty awesome. Funnily enough, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser are still active in the world of role-playing games, as in recent years, Goodman Games acquired the license from Fritz Leiber's estate to produce an entire series of Lankhmar-themed adventure modules for their Dungeon Crawl Classics role-playing game. They might not be the most famous fantasy heroes, but Faf and Mouse are still active today, and I think that's pretty awesome. But hey, that's going to do it for this episode of Appendix N Adventures. Please let me know, guys. Have you read Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser? What do you think of it? What do you think of the original sword and sorcery bromance? Let me know in the comments below. And until next time, as always, farewell and keep reading.
Speak of frost and fire, the frost months stream in the fire divine, the frost preserves and the fire destroys.
Oh, I don't know what that was. It's going in the video, though. Going in the video. Because I have the voice of an angel